So you've reached the end of the Scarlet Letter, Lord willing. If you haven't, pause the video and go finish the book, okay? I hope you enjoyed this read. I actually have grown in my affection for the book the more times I read it. I think the first read, it's a great story. But the more you read it, it's like if you go and read it again a second time later in life or a third, I think that the treasures that are there start to come to the surface a little bit more. So I hope that this book is one that you will pick up again later in your life someday. I think all good books are like that, when you read a good book, it's not check it off your list and never read it again. Good books are part of this great conversation of life and big ideas. And so I hope that someday you will pick it up and read it again. So we will discuss the end of the book in class together on Thursday, as well as talk about your writing prompt. So I have some writing instructions that will pop up in Google Classroom on Thursday, and then I'll pass them out in class too, so you'll have them as well. This video in particular just has to deal with some details, just kind of nitty-gritty about writing. When you write an essay for the humanities, you use what is called a Works Cited page. And I know I've referenced this before, but we haven't really taken the time to talk through it and teach you exactly how to do it. I'm guessing that in GWL 1 prior, or if you're from if you've had other English classes in another school, that you've done a Works Cited page. Sometimes it might be called a bibliography. Bibliographies are great. That's really referencing all the material that you've used to help you with a research paper. A Works Cited page is different in that you're really only referencing the work that you are mentioning in your paper. And for a literary essay, at least this is my viewpoint. Other teachers, when you go to college, might suggest differently, and that's okay. You kind of just do what your teacher recommends. But in terms of writing about literature, it's not a research paper. I am not asking you to go out onto the World Wide Web and find information about the Scarlet Letter. I'm really asking you to interact with the story. And so I am not looking for a lot of different works that you're going to reference and then bring those to bear on the story. I'm actually looking for you to engage with the book. So your Works Cited list is going to be fairly short. Primarily, it's going to be the Scarlet Letter. And we'll talk about some other things that you could put in there. If you use a quote, usually if a quote is in the public domain, I don't think it has to necessarily be in your Works Cited page. But we'll talk about that in class. But for the Works Cited, let me share the screen with you. There is a resource, there has been a resource up in Google Classroom. So I'm going to open that up. Okay, so if you scroll down, you've got your weekly checklists here, and then under there you have classroom resources. And if you click on this MLA page format example, there's two things. The top part of the handout shows you how your page should be set up. Now, 1-inch margin is standard, so you should have a 1-inch margin from the top and the sides. That should just be automatically set on your computer. I'm getting a few papers that don't have 1-inch margins, so check that. Your header is double-spaced. Your writing is double-spaced. And then a reminder, we use just a very standard font. Could be Times New Roman, Arial, Calibri. Any of those are acceptable. I'm not sure. What does Google Docs default to, Alex? Do you know?
To what?
The font.
The font?
I'm not exact. Well, it does do 11, size 11. Sorry, I'm kind of playing with my computer and switched over. But if it's a Calibri, that's totally fine. All I'm asking is that you don't use big, bold, silly fonts. You don't need that, okay? And then also notice that the title doesn't need to be bold. It doesn't need to be larger than anything else. It just needs to remain in that 12-point font. 11 is fine if you're writing it on Google Docs because that's kind of the default for Google Docs. Okay, so we've kind of talked about this for sure in class. Let's take a look at this example. Now, pretend, you got to use your imagination, that this is its own page. The Works Cited page does not go on the bottom of your paper. And I know that saves space and saves room, but just to get you in the habit of academic expectations, the practice for, say, when you go to college and you write about literature, I want you to make sure that your Works Cited is a standalone page, and it is the last page of your essay. So note that we're just going to say this is the 5th page of whatever essay that was turned in. And my last name is on there. I wish I could change that because that's actually wrong. I'm just noticing that for the first time. That's wrong. Well, maybe not. I don't want to confuse you. Let's say I wrote the paper. It would be my last name plus the page number. Does that make sense? But your brand is your teacher's name. So I don't want you to think you're putting your teacher's name there. You're putting your last name there. So it would be Gearlings 3 if you wrote 2-page paper and your 3rd page was your Works Cited. Or Smith 5. So whatever your last page is, I want to make sure you have your last name and the page number there, okay? It's just part of your paper, but it is its own separate page. Note that the title is Works Cited. That is it. It's not bold, it's not big, it's just double-spaced and centered. That's enough to set it apart and that it stands alone. Let me just show you a few marks or characteristics of the Works Cited page. Notice we have 3 references here. Alistair Begg, Frederick Buckner, John Skillen. Okay. For some reason, the second line here is cut off, but just to show you how it's set up, okay? Begg, Buckner, Skillen. What do you notice? It's alphabetical. And so your Works Cited, whatever they would be, would go in alphabetical order if you have more than one. Also notice that visually you see one of these lines is different. So for the Buckner entry, it was long, telling the truth. The gospel is tragedy, comedy, and fairy tale. Excellent book. And it has to move into the second line. Harper 1, that's the publisher, 1977. That has to get indented. Why? Well, visually, it shows me, the teacher, as I look at your Works Cited page, that I can easily identify who your sources are. So when you get to a second line, it's indented so that I notice that's still part of the entry. It's not a new entry. So that's just a routine visual trick that you would use in a Works Cited entry if you have to go to the second line. Okay. So what do you put in the Works Cited entry? Well, notice these each start with the author. So when you go to do your scarlet letter, Works Cited, you will take the author, Nathaniel Hawthorne. So you'll put his last name, Hawthorne, comma, Nathaniel, period. You follow the format that is given. A great resource, and I will make sure that I put a link to it in Google Classroom. This is the one that I use all the time, and there are many others, but I use the Purdue OWL, the online writing lab. I use them. And just so you know, even as an adult, I don't memorize all of these things. They change often, right? I know that the MLA rules, I think they're on their 8th edition. So it changes, not so often that you'd have to constantly relearn something, but often enough. So what I do is I go to a website and I just imitate the format. I imitate the form. Then I know I'm doing it right. So it's the author's last name, comma, first name, period. And then you're going to do the title of the book. So it'll be Hawthorne, comma, Nathaniel, period, the Scarlet Letter, period. Now notice that the names of these first 2 entries are books and they're italicized. The name of a book gets italicized. This 3rd entry is from a magazine. And so that would get quotation marks. The link that I'll give you for Purdue OWL will help you with all those different kinds of resources. I know when you do a research paper, it gets really tricky because you might be using a lot of online sources, and there are specific ways to set those up in a Works Cited page. But for our purposes, we're just using the novel, and so you're going to italicize the title. After you italicize it, you're going to find the publication company. And where do you find that? So usually in the front of the book. So you'll have some kind of front matter. This talks about Nathaniel Hawthorne's bio and, of course, the title page. And we have way down here, Bantam Classics. Pretty sure that that's the publisher. So I'm going to write Bantam Classics, comma, and then I need the year that it was published. Now, this is a very old book. It's been published a lot of times. So I'm looking for the most recent publication of my particular book. Not necessarily the date that the story was first published, okay? So I'm just gonna scroll down and I'm going to look at my particular book's printing and I will find the year. And all that information is right here, very, very close to the front. Now, you may have a different one. Yours might be the blue one, right, Alex, like this? So Alex is sitting next to me. Yours is this. You're gonna have to do the same thing. You're gonna have to look at the front matter. So this one is a Dover, so it's Dover Publications, comma, Inc. And then the year is going to be on the next page, so you'll find it there, okay? Thanks. So that's the Works Cited page. It's pretty much a format that you have to follow, so it's not that tricky. You just have to take the time to set it up correctly, okay? And let me just go back to the idea of what you're putting in your Works Cited. You absolutely are putting the Scarlet Letter in there. This is not a research paper. I don't want you going out and finding out a bunch of other resources. This is your thoughts and your interaction with the Scarlet Letter. So I'm actually discouraging you from going out and finding other resources to use. All right, so primarily the Scarlet Letter, if you have a particular quote that you want to use, say from your commonplace book, if it's one that's in the public domain, you're free to use it. And I don't think, I'll double check on that, but I don't think you have to necessarily put it in Works Cited. If it is from a particular book that you're reading now, say something by Andrew Peterson, or I may think of something else that has to do with the idea of confession or sin, or if it's from a particular book that you're reading right now, then you probably definitely want to reference that in your Works Cited, okay? And we'll talk about that more in class. All right, one other thing that I want to mention. I know I called this a Works Cited video, but I'm going to slip something else in there. So let me kind of stop share on this Works Cited page. And that Works Cited page is in your classroom resources in Google Classroom. I'm talking really fast. If you want to just stop and go look at it and see the model for how to set that up, you're welcome to do that. I want to share one more thing with you, and that is, how do you do in-text citation? Because when you write your essay, you are going to use quotes from the book. How do you tell your reader where those quotes are from? I'm going to show you how to do that, okay? And there's just a couple rules for you to have to learn, and they're not super hard. And once you know them, they work for everything. Like when we read Shakespeare next year, or when we read let's see, Fahrenheit 451 or The Great Gatsby, you're going to do this the same way. So I really quickly here wrote you a paragraph. It's my first draft. You know, I'm sure I could fix it, clean up, make it better. But I just typed this up, threw in some quotes so I could help you to see how you incorporate a quote into your paragraphs. All right, so my opening sentence says, Hawthorne points to death as the spiritual state of both Dimmesdale and Prynne. He uses the setting of a cemetery to remind the reader of death and associates this location with Dimmesdale's home. As Dimmesdale returns from the forest, he arrives home, and I just kind of folded this quote into my sentence, so I didn't necessarily use a comma here. He arrives home on the edge of the burial ground. Notice the part I quote gets the quotation marks. But my punctuation here shows up after my page numbers. So here's my quote, on the edge of the burial ground, end quote, space, and then, see, I got too much, see, I just typed it without revising it. I put in parentheses the page numbers. It's called a parenthetical citation. That means that if my teacher wants to check my work or check my quote or, oh, that's really interesting, I think I want to read that for myself, I can turn to that page number and I can find your quote. Notice in the parenthetical citation, I do not use this, P for page, don't use that. I don't use PG for page, don't need it. It's very simple. It's just the parentheses and the page numbers. There's a couple tweaks on that. I'm not going to tell them for you right now. It has to do with the way page numbers, if you have long, I'll tell you later. Right now, just put the page numbers in there. You don't need P or PG at all. Just put in the numbers. And that references the page number that that quote is from. In addition, Hawthorne places Prynne in the middle of New England town celebration, a time of festivity and merriment. Yet, his description of her points to her spiritual condition. He describes her face as, and I'll put a comma there, it was like a mask, or rather, like the frozen calmness of a dead woman's features. Owing this dreary resemblance to the act, should be fact. I typed this really fast. No, it's fact. See, everybody revises. Owing this dreary resemblance to the fact that Hester was actually dead. Hawthorne catalogs both the good works and penance of Dimmesdale and Prynne, but articulates that each are dead. Their good works and their penance are not enough to make them spiritually alive. All right, let's go back to this quote about Prynne. My quote is in quotation marks. I did not use the entire quote. I could, but I don't need it. I kind of really only want to use the part of the quote that I need to support my point. Otherwise, it gets really wordy and it's too much. So it's okay to just use part of a quote. So notice I use this ellipsis to let my reader know there's more, but this is all that we needed. So I have my end quote here, and then I show my page number, 203. That's where it is, 203. And again, don't need a P or PG, just simply that. All right, now I want to interact with this text for just a minute. Imagine with me that in this paper, this quote is my very first quote. It's the first one I use in my paper. I've got an introduction, and then I get to my first point, that Hawthorne points to death as the spiritual state of Dimmesdale and Prynne. That's my first point. Haven't used a quote yet. This is my first quote. This is what I have to do. And I don't want to throw you off here. Whenever you use the first quote of an author, you include their last name. That's it, Hawthorne, 199 to 200. I'm not going to use it ever again in this paper. It gets a little more complicated than that when you have lots and lots of sources. So, because what this does is this points my reader to my Works Cited, that this is where I got this information from Hawthorne's text. Let's say I incorporate an article about the Scarlet Letter, and I use a quote from there. I would have to use his last name with the quote. Does that make sense? And then if you shift back and forth and use multiple quotes, there's some other references you have to do to their last name. But for now, I just want you to put Hawthorne's last name in the very first quote that you use. It won't show up again. It's just a good habit for you to learn that you, on your first quote, have to reference who the citation belongs to, right? It belongs to Hawthorne. It's kind of a no-brainer, since really I'm just writing about the Scarlet Letter and it's really the only thing in my Works Cited, but it's a habit that you probably should learn, okay? All right, so for us and for our purposes, I want you to put Hawthorne's last name in the first quote that you use. For every subsequent quote, just the page numbers. That's it. Does that make sense? There are some variations to this. Let's say that Hawthorne, in his quote, ends on the edge of the burial ground with an exclamation point. then I'm going to include it. Exclamation point. Right, I can't think and talk at the same time. Apparently, where's the exclamation point? There it is. All right. On the edge of the burial ground! Exclamation point. You would include that. Then you would also follow up the very end of the sentence and the citation with a period. Let's say that it ended with a question, and it won't make sense in this way, but let's say the quote you use is a question. You include the question, end quote, the page number, and then a period. But for most quotes that end with just regular period punctuation, you leave it off here. You include their citation within the parentheses, and then you end it with a period. Just a practice to get into, and the more you write, I think the more you'll be able to pick up on these kinds of forms that exist for MLA. And good writers probably get in the habit of referencing a site like Purdue OWL to help them to make sure that they're setting things up correctly. All right. And these forms and these rules work for all humanities classes. So when you go to college, if you're in a history class, if you're in a literature class, if you're in a writing class, if you're in a philosophy class, all of these rules will apply. Where it gets a little tricky is when you're in a science class. Science doesn't use MLA. Science uses what's called APA. And if you learn the MLA, it's really easy to just learn the form, a new form for APA. There are definitely things that are different about it. There are other styles too, called the Chicago style. There's many different ways. MLA is the most standard general form that schools, high schools, secondary schools will use. Once you learn to master one form, it is not hard to master another form. It is just a matter of getting to know that form and using a reference guide. So we're going to just stick in the world of MLA because that's kind of what most secondary schools use to teach you the form, and that's standard across the board. So if you learn it in this class, you can go to another class that is in the humanities world and you should be just fine. So that is just a little bit of information on how to set up a Works Cited, and then I slipped in some stuff there about how to cite your actual quotes, your sources. We are going to have some writing time in class, so let me just kind of give you a vision before I end up this video. This Thursday, we're going to wrap up this story. We're going to have our final discussion about what Hawthorne was doing and the world of the Scarlet Letter. And we'll talk about romanticism. We'll talk about the Puritan legalism. We'll talk about Christianity. And hopefully we'll just have a great discussion. And then I'm going to give you your handout on how to begin to think about writing an essay for the Scarlet Letter. Then you're going on Thanksgiving break, and I won't see you until December 2nd. When you come back, you will have a thesis due, and I'll talk to you in class with that on Thursday. And the outline as well. I want you to think through some things those first couple days before you go on Thanksgiving break. So you'll come back to class with at least some ideas in your brain about where you're going. And then that day is a writing day. When you come back on December 2nd, we will spend the whole time kind of walk you through how to set up your paragraphs. You'll have time in class to be looking through your books for support for your points. You can work in class on writing, and I'm going to be there kind of as a writing coach that day. I'll walk around. I'll help you with your ideas, with your questions, anything that you have. All right. We'll kind of work that way. It'll be like a writing workshop is what it is on December 2nd. And we're going to take our time. You're going to give me a rough draft. We're going to peer edit it together in class. I'm going to give you specific things that you have to put in your paper, and we'll work through those in class. You actually have about a month to work on the paper, and we're going to baby step our way through it so that in January, month from, let's see, and about exactly a month, maybe it's the 14th, from me giving you the assignment, we'll have walked through several things so that you can have a really nice literary essay to turn in. All right, that's where we're going. See you on Thursday. God bless you and have a great day.